Yeah, we talk about the deep state, we talk about the globalists, inflation versus deflation.
Well, I mean,
You're at Mar-a-Lago. I'm baffled that this isn't front page news.
Do you guys support a specific political party, or do you dislike both of them?
Oh, it worked like a charm on you guys.
Let's go, Brandon.
What is up, everybody? So, late episode, I know. My bad. I was at the office all day. But I've been having a lot of people say to me, really love when you do the deep dive stuff and the stuff that isn't really talked about every day. This is going to be an increasingly important issue. Who owns the Federal Reserve? What laws does it operate under? And what is its origin story? And what is the stuff that they don't want us to know? Because you hear a very different reality when they talk about it day to day, and the true power and the craziness behind it. So first, I have a little compilation of things that you should see and know about the Federal Reserve, what some of the people who are running things have said about it. Quick little 2-minute clip about that and what Trump has said about it. And then after that, we are going to listen to a presentation by what I think one of the greatest researchers of all time, probably the most knowledgeable person about the Federal Reserve that I've ever come across. So I will show you that and give you the context of it in just a minute. But first, let's run this compilation.
Mr. Rothschild, the Federal Reserve is one of these organizations that it's a private bank.
That was started by your family.
No, it's completely untrue. I was asked that earlier. It really isn't true.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. What the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
The loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, let's start with which central banks got the money.
There are 14 of them, which are listed I'm sure they're listed in here somewhere.
All right, so who actually made that decision to hand out $1 trillion that way? $500 billion. Who made that decision?
The Federal Open Market Committee.
Okay, and was it done at one time or in a series of meetings?
A series of meetings.
And under what legal authority?
We have a long-standing legal authority to do swaps with other central banks.
Do you happen to know anything?
It's not an emergency authority of any kind.
Anything specific about it?
Do you know my counsel says Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act.
Some of the president-elect's advisors have suggested that you should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Can you follow up on, do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No. Do you believe the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
The Federal Reserve is a very interesting thing, and it's sort of gotten it wrong a lot. Do you know the United States in 1870 to 1913, that was the richest period in the history of the United States.
So I'm glad that Trump mentions that right there, that time period between 1870 and 1913 was the most prosperous time for the United States, because we know the second central bank ended 1836. Andrew Jackson, thank you. Then we had some turmoil between that. We had the Civil War. Then after Civil War, 1870 through 1913, booming economy, the age of the Industrial Revolution, very prosperous. But things kind of went downhill after that when we allowed the central bankers back into our everyday lives. So with that, we have Eustace Mullins, who is the Grand Master of Federal Reserve information. Let me just give you some information about him real quick before we get this party going. So Eustace Mullins is a veteran of the United States Air Force with 38 months of active service during World War II. He did his research at the Library of Congress, was directed and reviewed daily by George Stimson, founder of National Press Club in Washington, whom the New York Times on September 28, 1952 called a, quote, highly regarded reference source on the Capitol. Government officials, congressmen, and reporters went to him for information on any subject. While researching this material, Eustace Mullins was on the staff of the Library of Congress. Mullins later was a consultant on a highway finance for American Petroleum Institute. So very, very credible source. And he was really the godfather of, I guess, revealing the true nature of the Federal Reserve, because there's nothing like what they tell us. So without further ado, let's kick this thing off, and I will intermittently interject and give some more context for things he says that might be a little bit crazy or over the head of the somebody who doesn't watch this type of stuff every day.
Well, we're going to cover a big subject tonight, the Federal Reserve. And interestingly enough, for many years, the analysts on Wall Street denied that they were Fed watchers. They say, oh, no, we don't do that because we do our own analysis and we draw up our independent things on stocks and so forth. But the fact is, they just watched the Fed, and they knew when the Fed was going to raise or lower the interest rate, and it was very easy for them. And at the same time, they officially denied that this is the way they operated. So actually, the Federal Reserve made it a lot easier for Wall Street stockbrokers and speculators, because the whole Federal Reserve System was set up originally to help speculation. That's all it was for. It was for people who wanted to speculate and make big money fast. Otherwise, they wouldn't even bother to put it through. Because what we had before the Federal Reserve System was we had a national system of what is called one-name paper. I lent you $10, you gave me a note for $10, and you repaid me the $10. Well, the international banking community knew that there was billions of dollars to be made from negotiable instrument, trading in debt. So we went from one-name paper to two-name paper, three-name paper. In other words, you would owe a debt to somebody, and that guy would sell it to somebody else for a small profit. He would sell it to somebody else, and everybody made a little money on the way. So they completely transformed the credit structure, not only of the United States, but of the entire world. And this trading in paper was called acceptances. You accepted a debt from someone else, so they had an official banking name for it, acceptances. And the biggest acceptance dealers in the world were the Rothschilds and their agent, Paul Warburg.
There it is.
Who had a company in New York called the International Acceptance Corporation. So Paul Warburg was the actual author of the Federal Reserve Act. And he was part of the crowd that went down to Jekyll Island on a secret meeting the week of Thanksgiving, 1910. Now, they had the Panic of 1907, which caused a lot of banks to fail and a lot of widespread misery. And so, supposedly, an outcry arose from the American people for banking reform. Well, this cry didn't come from the American people. It came from the Wall Street bankers.
By the way, quick fun fact about the crash of 1907, which prompted the Federal Reserve. Totally manufactured situation. I'm going to cover that more deeply in the episode that I do about this. It's part of the series of The Men Who Broke America. But the crash of 1907 was caused because there was this fantastic copper company that the Rockefellers wanted to control because it was much more efficient than their copper company. The owners of that company basically said, no, take rocks. And the Rockefellers sort of baited them into trying to short squeeze them. And then somebody on the inside of that smaller company told the Rockefellers what they were doing. So it put them in a position where they were trying to short squeeze the Rockefellers, and they got kind of blown out and ruined because of it. And that made the whole market kind of have this crash response. So very unorganic situation. So whatever anybody tells you about the crash of 1907 made this a necessity. That's BS. They orchestrated that, and they made all the mainstream colleges say, oh, this is why we need the Federal Reserve. This is why we need the Federal Reserve. And Woodrow Wilson, the dean of Princeton at the time, was one of the loudest voices in advocating for the Federal Reserve. So something very important to know.
They were the ones that wanted banking reform because they wanted it on their own terms. But what they were conditioning the American people to accept banking reform. And so they had President Theodore Roosevelt create the National Monetary Commission in 1908. And the National Monetary Commission was going to bring banking reform to the American people. So who did they get for the National Monetary Commission? They got some of the leading bankers, Paul Warburg and some of the other people from Wall Street. Because bankers always say, well, if you're not a banker, you couldn't possibly know anything about banking. Well, you know to pay the note every month at the bank, but that's all you know. So they got bankers to study banking reform. So these studies consisted of trips to Europe. And so the National Monetary Commission took a couple of jaunts to Europe, and they were wined and dined all over Europe and by the Rothschilds and other bankers. But they came back with absolutely no results. This had gone on for 2 years. And so they issued a report that we have met with some of the leading bankers of Europe and we have studied the problem, and we're now going over our results. Well, there were no results. So then they secretly went down to Jekyll Island, the Millionaires Club, and when they got there, everything was conspiratorial. They sent all the servants on vacation. The family servants, of course, knew them all, and they brought in servants for the occasion from the mainland who didn't know any of these people. And they agreed that they would only address each other by the first name. And they later called themselves the First Name Club. So Paul Warburg was Paul, Henry Davison was Henry, and Senator Aldrich was Nelson. I'm quite sure Senator Aldrich, who was quite a pompous guy, didn't like being called by his first name, but that was part of the act that they were going through.
Aldrich was like the Chuck Schumer of the time. He was the Senate Majority Leader. You're going to hear that name a lot.
To put this over on the American...
Married into the Rockefeller family, because that's, that's the way he tried to accumulate wealth.
People. So they actually sat down and drafted this bill in the dining room of this hotel. And about 5 years ago, I suggested to one of the people I wrote for, L.T. Patterson of Criminal Politics, that he have a meeting down there. I said, we'll call it a commemorative meeting, just to memorialize the fellows. Well, he agreed, and he got his people together, and we all went down to Jekyll Island for the anniversary celebration. And it worked out real well. Jekyll Island is a beautiful place. The hotel has been redone, and it's no longer the Millionaires Club, of course. It's a Radisson, actually, Radisson of Jekyll Island. So you've got a Radisson right across the street here. So they're a pretty good hotel chain. And they have preserved the dining room just as it was when they wrote the act there in 1910. And they have plaques on the wall. And they say that these people, these selfless bankers met here and on their own time and devised banking reform for the American people. And so that's the way they put it across. But now they had to get this through Congress. And of course, there was tremendous anti-banker sentiment in Congress, mostly from the Midwest and the Western states, which were the more independent people and also smaller populations, because the Eastern Seaboard had always been controlled by the international bankers. And that's why they have what they call the Eastern Seaboard Republicans, and they have the Republicans from the rest of the country, and they are totally different people, because the Eastern Seaboard Republicans are the old bankers, what they call liberal Republicans, the Nelson Rockefeller people. And then you have the real Republicans are in the Midwest and the West. And they're mostly Republicans out in this part because people are very self-reliant and very independent. So when they went before Congress, they knew they had to have a good act. So they devised a plan that they would offer two separate plans to Congress. the Republicans would offer the Aldrich Plan, which was the plan that they had drafted down at Jekyll Island to set up a central bank. And the Democratic Party would offer a Democratic plan, which they called the Federal Reserve Plan. And they were actually the same plan. Some commentators pointed out they were exactly alike. But generally, the people fell for it, and there was a lot of publicity about there were attacks against the evil Wall Street Aldrich Plan, and that, but luckily, we were being offered an alternate plan, which would be a people's plan by the Democratic Party to be called the Federal Reserve. So, if you were a good Democrat, you supported the Federal Reserve Plan. If you were a good Republican, you supported the Aldrich Plan. And so, but they really needed Woodrow Wilson. They knew he would sign the act into law if he was elected president. So they wanted to elect him president in 1912 in order to put this deal over. And the problem was he was not charismatic, and he had been president of Princeton. He was a dry, pompous, academic person, absolutely no popular appeal whatsoever.
Worst guy.
But Rockefeller and the National City Bank decided to go with him anyway. So they chose him as their candidate. But President Taft, the incumbent president, was a Republican, very popular. He was a really overweight guy. He weighed 300 or 400 pounds. He had to have a special bathtub at the White House, which you could put an elephant in. And but he was very popular because he was good-natured, and we had prosperity. And so it looked like Taft was going to be elected. So they always come up with some kind of conspiratorial operation. So they went to Theodore Roosevelt, who of course was very unhappy at not being in the White House. He had served his term and that was over. So, and there really wasn't anything for him to do. So they persuaded Roosevelt to split the Republican Party and run as an independent bull moose candidate.
Demon.
Which he did. And so that elected Wilson by a large majority. And so now Wilson had a mandate from the people to sign the Federal Reserve Act. So now they started the debate in Congress. Well, Congressman Lindbergh, the father of the aviator from Minnesota, led the opposition. And Lindbergh was a very knowledgeable person. He was the lawyer for some of the bigger companies like Weyerhaeuser Lumber. He represented them, and in fact, he built a 30-room mansion up there at Little Falls on the lake, on the I guess it was on the Mississippi River. And a year later, it burned down. So they built a smaller house there, and that house is there today, and that is the Lindbergh Museum. I was there 2 years ago. And it's a very interesting exhibit. It's not far from Minneapolis. So Lindbergh led the fight in Congress, and he had a lot of support against the banking bill, not the Federal Reserve plan as it was offered. So Paul Warburg himself and some of the other bankers, for the first time in their lives, had to come down from New York and actually lobby in the halls of Congress. So they made every promise in the world to get that act through. And here is Paul Warburg, whom no one had ever seen in Washington before. He'd like to stay in the background. And here he is walking through the halls of Congress to get people to enact the Federal Reserve Act. And because Wilson was not popular, they took a Virginia congressman. Wilson also was born in Virginia, by the way. He's born in my hometown of Stanton, Virginia. And Carter Glass was from Lynchburg, and he was very popular. So it was Carter Glass who got the Federal Reserve Act through Congress. And, of course, he lived on that very well for the rest of his life. They made him senator, and so he became very old in office and in the 30s. And, in fact, he was reelected twice after he was totally senile. He couldn't even make a public appearance or cast a vote in Senate, but it was sort of like a referendum in Russia or Germany, see. In Virginia, everything was totally controlled, so they reelected him twice after he was no longer able to even speak. And so this was just one of the triumphs of democracy that we have. But that was his reward for having gotten the Federal Reserve Act through, that he was guaranteed a seat in the Senate for the rest of his life. And he was finally replaced. He died, so they replaced him by a congressman named Willis Robertson, who was part of the old Harry Byrd machine.
Hit that like button,
And,
guys.
Harry Byrd himself was part of the establishment. And his closest friend was Admiral Louis Strauss, who was a partner of Kuhn Loeb Company, the Rothschild banking house in New York, which Paul Warburg was a partner
Kuhn
of.
Loeb.
So you had Harry Byrd lobbying for the Federal Reserve Act, and you had Willis Robertson, who's the father of the great evangelist Pat Robertson, whom I went to college with at Washington Lee. And at that time, he was a plump, lazy boy whom you would never think of either going into religion or banking. And in fact, his grades were so low he could not get into the Washington Lee Law School, even though his father was senator, chairman of the banking committee in Washington, and he was an old Lexington family. But he finally wound up going to Yale and squeaking through Yale. I don't think he ever passed the bar exam. So then his wife said, well, let's do something for poor people. So they started a little church and started broadcasting. And then he came down to Virginia Beach, and a friend of mine named Reverend Stallings helped him get set up down there. And they later parted company. I know the man well. And but Pat was on his way. And with this impeccable Wall Street background, Pat was able to build up a broadcasting empire. When your father has been chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, it does open a few doors, you know. So he always had plenty of financial support for this television empire which he built up. If he hadn't had that family background, he would never gotten off the ground, because nobody would put a dime in this kind of thing unless they had certain goals that they wanted to achieve. And of course, they used Pat Robertson politically ever since. He ran for president, and he's done various things. And he's always there when they need him. That's the important thing. You can't always use these people every day. But to get back to the battle for the Federal Reserve Act in Congress in 1913, Lindbergh was having enormous effect, and it didn't look like they would ever get it passed. But Warburg kept working. And so what they did, they went through Congress, and they made every congressman tremendous promises. And but they still did not have a majority. So they waited until the Christmas vacation. And so when Lindbergh and the other Midwestern and Western congressmen went away for Christmas, they'd be gone 3 or 4 weeks.
This is
we
wild.
didn't have jet planes at that time.
This is wild.
So as soon as they left town, they brought the bill up before Congress, and the Congress, which barely had a quorum, hastily passed it on December the 23rd. Well, even the New York Times said, legislation of this importance has never been passed under such circumstances, because congressional courtesy dictated that you would not pass on major legislation while the other congressmen who opposed it were away. I mean, it was just common decency. And so the Federal Reserve Act was actually fraudulent when it was passed, because it would never have passed if the opponents had not left town.
Mm-hmm.
So it was legal, but it was immoral and indecent that they passed it the way they did. That was the only way they knew they could ever get it through Congress. And so they said, well, if that's what we have to do, we'll do it. And they did it. And so that is the real background of the Federal Reserve Act, which few people know that. I actually researched in the New York Times and got the actual quotations, and I have it in my book, the commentary when it was finally passed. And so the world was waiting for the Federal Reserve Act for a very simple reason. Europe had not been able to have a war since 1885. They were all set for a war, but all of the European countries had been bankrupted by their central banks. Central bank always bankrupts a country because they spend all the money. And so they knew the only way they could finance a world war was from the wealth of the American people.
So yeah, you cannot say it's a coincidence that the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, or excuse me, the Federal Reserve and the IRS are created in 1913, then 1914, World War I magically happens. That's not a coincidence.
But without a central bank, they couldn't do that. So as soon as they got the Federal Reserve Act enacted into law on December 23rd, 1913, a few weeks later, J.P. Morgan Company, which had been represented at the Jekyll Island meeting by his lieutenant, Henry P. Davison, Morgan himself did not want to appear personally at the Jekyll Island meeting because it would compromise the whole situation. If they knew J.P. Morgan was there, that meant it was a banker's bill. So he stayed away. And Henry Davison, who was not so well known, was his right-hand man. And he organized the American Red Cross also. And so Davison was Morgan's man at the Jekyll Island conference. And so the Morgan Company has always played a large role in the Federal Reserve. In fact, Alan Greenspan, the present chairman, before he was appointed to the Federal Reserve Board, was a partner of J.P. Morgan Company, which probably qualified him for that job, you know, and or at least J.P. Morgan thought he did, so that's why he got the job.
And in case you don't know, J.P. Morgan was a front man for the Rothschilds. He died not very rich at all, and the reason that he was a frontman for the Rothschilds is because his father's financial business was saved by the Bank of England during one of the major crashes. It was the only one that was saved, and they were forever indebted to the Rothschilds. They were even went so far as to pretend they were anti-Semitic to further disguise that the fact that they were the frontman for the Rothschilds.
See, all these Federal Reserve Board people are chosen by the Wall Street bankers. Obviously, the president, who nominally rubber stamps these appointments, he didn't know any of these people. He doesn't know anything about banking. I don't know when we've had a president who was a banker, because bankers for a long time have been in poor repute among the American people, and with very good reason. So if you could imagine a banker running for president, he wouldn't get very far. So what you have to do is pick other people and then put up the money for them to be elected. So these bankers have always put their people on the Federal Reserve Board. And as I say, the first thing they did was lend Great Britain $400 million from J.P. Morgan. Well, that was to start the World War I. It was like a declaration of war, but no one knew it. They thought, well...
This guy's name is Eustace Mullins, Denise, and anybody else. So he's like the OG researcher for the Federal Reserve, wrote a ton of books about it and a lot of other things. And super legit guy. I was served for the military, researched from the Library of Congress, and got all kinds of publicity from like major newspapers and whatnot. So super serious, legit guy.
It's just an ordinary loan. And so then J.P. Morgan actually kept the money and became the purchasing agent for Great Britain in the United States. So he spent all that money in this country buying munitions for England and shipping the munitions to England so they could start the war.
Imagine that.
So that's how it was done. And of course, Germany, after the war, they wanted to try the Kaiser for planning to make war against its peaceful neighbors and so forth. Well, actually, the Kaiser didn't know any of this was going on, or that he was being set up, and that Germany was going to be attacked. So anyway, that's the way it worked.
I don't know if he's going to mention this, but get this. So the guy, Paul Warburg, he keeps mentioning, who is the architect of the Federal Reserve Act and worked for the Rothschilds. His brother, Max Warburg, was the Minister of War for the Kaiser, for Germany during World War I. So both sides of the thing, they had this thing figured out.
They started World War I, and only because they had the Federal Reserve System. And once they got it started, they realized, well, the central bank is going to be great. And sure enough, they did the same thing in 1939. They started Act II of the World War I, which became World War II. And of course, both times we had a president who campaigned for office on the pledge he would keep us out of war. Wilson campaigned in 1916, and he boasted to the American people, "I have kept you out of war, and so you should reelect me." And then, of course, as soon as he was reelected, he took us into the war. Well, Roosevelt campaigned, he said, "American boys will never die in foreign fields." And he stumped the entire country, assuring everybody of this. And so then, after he was reelected, of course, they had decoded the Japanese radio, and they knew that the Japanese fleet was on its way to attack Pearl Harbor. So they made sure not to tell anybody, because the Japanese was sailing under strict orders. If they were detected en route, or if they had any reason to believe that the Americans were expecting them, they were to turn around and go home.
Remember, hit that like button.
Which would have meant the U.S. would not have gotten into the war. So the night before Pearl Harbor, 3 people met at the White House. That was with Roosevelt. That was George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff, and Bernard Baruch, who was the banker, who was the intimate of the president's. And they were sitting there absolutely terrified, in fear that the Japanese would turn back and that 3,500 American boys would not be killed the next day. And so anyway, their night's vigil paid off, and the Japanese attacked, and we were in the war. So that's how it was all done. One of the greatest acts of treason against the American people, and the fact that all these American boys died in these ships, and sank and were killed and bombed. They were bombed. And they had not an inkling that all this was happening, although it was, they knew in Washington it was coming. So to cover up for themselves, the Roosevelt administration then indicted Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the 2 commanders of Pearl Harbor, on the grounds that they had been negligent, that they had let the Japanese come in there and attack them. And of course, they had not a clue that any of this was happening, and that Washington knew all about it and refused to tell them. In fact, I think the Army in Washington did send, by ordinary first-class mail, a note to the Pearl Harbor commanders that they might expect a Japanese invasion, and it arrived there a couple days after Pearl Harbor, of course. But that was the most urgent way that they had of notifying our troops in Pearl Harbor that the Japanese were going to attack. So it worked out just right, and we were in the war, and everything was underway. So this is how a central bank works. It's constantly active politically. It's constantly planning for war. And the reason they plan for war is, like Ezra Pound said many years ago, wars are created to make debt, because ordinary peacetime commerce can be profitable, goods are traded and people are employed, but war gives you the big money. When you get into war, you have billions and billions. And of course, during World War II, we had a very interesting system of production. It was called cost plus 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So
Still have that.
The more money, if you were manufacturing munitions, boats or guns or whatever, for the government, the more money you spent, the more money you made. So naturally, you were very generous to your workers, and you paid them enormous amounts of money, because every time you gave them a raise, you made an extra 10% on the raise. So nobody balked at this, and this was what they called the miracle of production of World War II. And all it was, they had unlimited funds from the government, and of course they made their money, and they got very rich. So in 1943, we did have a couple of successes, and Ezra Pound broadcast from Radio Rome at that time, and he said, well, you've had a couple of successes now, and you're scared out of your pants that the war is going to end, which of course they didn't want it to end in 1943. And that's why they fought World War II, to prolong it as long as possible. They had the step-by-step approach in the Pacific. Instead of attacking Japan, they attacked each one of these little islands at tremendous cost. Well, it was stupid, but it kept the war going. Oh, yeah. See, if it attacked Japan, it could have been over in a couple of weeks. That wasn't what they wanted. And it was the same way in Europe. They landed in Sicily and fought their way all the way up Italy through the mountains and so forth, which kept things going an extra year. Because if they had attacked France or Germany by land at that time, the war had been over in 6 months. But as they didn't want it that way, and so they prolonged it to 1945. So real strategy in a war is not how to win it, but how to keep it going as long as possible. That's when you have a bank behind it, because the bank wants to drag it out and make it as costly as possible, not only in money, but also in human lives. I mean, they were gambling with American lives when they prolonged the war and fought through the islands in the Pacific, fought up Italy. There was never, militarily, there was never any explanation that you could offer to justify this kind of campaign. And I guess Hitler knew what was going on anyway, because he was financed by the Bank of England. In fact, they put out the myth that the evil Hitler was financed by German industrialists, but in fact Hitler was disliked by the German manufacturing class, and so he had to go to Governor Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, to get his money. And he was broke when he went into office in 1933. So we had to fly a couple of lawyers to Cologne to meet with him and to assure him that he would get the money to keep him going. So, you know, they have war crimes for people like that. They had war crimes trials for people who plotted war. Well, the two war criminals in this case were John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles of the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, who were the lawyers for the international bankers. And the Dulles brothers went to Cologne and assured Hitler he would have money to keep the Nazi administration going. And he was actually financed too by the Schroeder Company of London, and one of the Schroeder directors, F.C. Tyrks, was a director of the Bank of England. So he had the governor of the Bank of England and Tyrks behind him, and with the money of the Bank of England behind him, Hitler was assured of having a Nazi regime and of starting World War II, which was the whole plan anyway.
Process that for a second. I mean, so that's going to be probably the episode after the next episode that comes out that I do. But like, there was the vast majority of the money that went to Hitler came from freaking Wall Street. All right. So this is why it's annoying that people get upset when you ask simple questions, or what maybe why they get so touchy when you ask very simple questions, like just where did the money come from? Why was the money coming from there? Why didn't the money stop at any point?
They didn't care what Hitler did as long as he got World War II going. And so that worked out, and that's how they had it. Without Hitler, there would never have been a Second World War, which means that the bankers would have lost many billions of dollars in profits. So he was a good investment for them. And so that's why they call him a monster today, because they don't want anybody to know about their association with him. Or, now they did try to indict Lieutenant General Schroeder, a German, who was head of the SS for war crimes after the end of World War II. So he was arrested very briefly and held in a camp and under British jurisdiction and quietly dropped. He was never tried. And he was the man who made the whole Hitler Nazi administration possible. So the war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials, they were recently reshown again. And the only reason they ever held the Nuremberg trials was that they wanted to silence the German generals who had knowledge about all this duplicity and how the Bank of England had financed Hitler. Well, they wanted to permanently silence them, so they hung them. And their crime was not war crimes at all. It was the fact they knew too much. and they were silenced, and they managed to conceal the background of what was going on. So this is how central banks work. They use everybody, and when they're through with you, they get rid of you by whatever means. They hang you, or you just disappear. And so this is the Federal Reserve system that we think is a unique American institution. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York alone, now there are 12 banks, of course, 12 Federal Reserve banks, but the bank in New York is called the Money Center Bank, and that is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York makes all the major decisions. Now, there was a piece in the paper yesterday about the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And in fact, he's a minor figure. He has no authority whatsoever. All the power is in New York. But they try to promote the other 11 presidents of these other 11 banks just to make them feel important, I guess. But the Money Center Bank has always done everything. And it was the directors of this one bank in New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which financed communism, and they were active in helping the Nazis, and they were active in helping the fascists in Italy. So all of these big political movements of the 20th century came right out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And that alone is a historical fact, which is very significant. But if you send,
I don't know if he's going to cover it or not, but also the Russian Revolution in 1917, also directly caused by Kuhn Loeb, Rothschild, Warburg, Federal Reserve, insane.
Your offspring to Yale or Princeton or Harvard, they will never hear one word about any of this. I don't care how much money you spend, they're not going to get this information. It's all a matter of record, but the professors know that they have very cushy jobs. They pay their professors very well now, about $150,000 a year. They get long vacations. They get all sorts of special perks, trips to Europe for conferences and things like that. Their children all get scholarships at the best colleges. So they're well taken care of. So they don't rock the boat. And they know to a T what they need to tell their students and what to keep from them. And of course, the main thing is they keep everything from them. They really don't know anything. And it's a very unfortunate situation, because when you see the price of college education in this country today, I think it's about $120,000 for a 4-year stint, and to realize that those students are being denied practically all information about what's going on, it's really robbery of a very gross kind. But that's the way the system is operated. And the reason is that all of these so-called Ivy League schools, like you have the Harvard School of Business, the most prestigious business school in the United States. Well, J.P. Morgan had a partner in the First National Bank called George Baker. George Baker was president of the bank, and they worked together for many years. Of course, George Baker made hundreds of millions of dollars. So he gave $25 million to Harvard for the School of Business. And the name is right there today, George F. Baker School of Business, because he gave them all the money. Well, why did George F. Baker give $25 million to Harvard for the School of Business? Because he knew that the students there would never be told anything about what's going on. In other words, he made an investment. He made an investment in the future that the students would never find out what they had been doing. And that's true. The Harvard School of Business was set up to return short-term profits. And anybody who's gone through the Harvard School of Business and become head of a Fortune 500 corporation, which many of them do, has the worst possible training, because they're not taught long-term development strategy. They're taught short-term profits. Make it in 3 months. Make junk and sell it fast. Make some money. And that's the total philosophy of that school. Well, that came from George Baker, because short-term profits, your banker wants you to make quick profits and pay off your loans to him. So he's not interested in a 5-year or 10-year development program where you make something really good and make it, something that can be admired throughout the world. They want you to turn out cheap junk, sell it fast, make a quick profit, and pay the banknotes. So this is the philosophy of the all the schools of business, because they followed the example of Harvard School of Business, Wharton School of Finance. These are the models, so they all fall into line and teach their students the same thing, which has been very destructive, because American corporations have actually fallen behind in development over the last 25 years. Japan and Germany, of course, have pushed way ahead and have done much better because they do not have the short-term strategy. The only way you could make real profits and build your company is to have a long-term strategy of development, research, building up your market, satisfying your customers. But American corporations are run like McDonald's. They turn out hamburgers real fast and they make money. But what's the future on that? I mean, the McDonald hamburger 10 years from now will be just like it is now. Maybe they'll extract a little more of the flavor from it, but they've done that already, so I don't think that'll happen. So when I was talking about people on Wall Street watching the Fed, they are operating from this same short-term results strategy. And so they really know just about what the Fed is going to do throughout an entire year. At the beginning of the year, they have an idea what the interest rates are going to be or interest reductions for that entire year. But they pretend that it's a great mystery, there's tremendous secrecy. They still will not publish the minutes of the Federal Reserve meetings of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, the Federal Reserve controls the economy through two ways. One is the interest rate, which is the price of money. Well, they control the economy through the interest rate. If they raise the interest rate, less money is available for investment, so prices will fall on Wall Street because the money to buy stocks is reduced. But the real operation is done through what is called the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee. Now, I've been writing about and studying the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee for over 50 years. Well, Time magazine has, very highly paid journalists. So on March the 23rd of 2000, they did a feature story on the Open Market Committee. Printed pictures of the members, told how they operated and everything. They discovered this in the year 2000. Well, I discovered it in 1948, so that puts me a little ahead of them. And Time magazine, of course, was founded by these same bankers in 1923. So from 1923 to the year 2000, they never knew that there was such a thing as the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee.
Wow.
So what is the importance of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee?
Set rates.
Well, it determines the volume of money available for investment at any time. The Open Market Committee buys or sells government bonds on the open market.
QE, QT.
Now, when they want prosperity and they want the market to go up, they buy government bonds.
You guys have seen before, I show the Fed balance sheet all the time on here. That's what he's speaking about. And I mean, it's crazy they talk about it here. This is like the early 2000s, but they really didn't start doing this in a big way until 2008. So it's crazy that like the degree to which we're doing that, they're doing that now versus before.
And so that creates more money. And so there's more money available for investment. And the next day after they do this, the stock market will go up 100 points. So anybody who happens to know that that's going to happen, and there are people who know, is in a very good position. But the average American investor hasn't a clue as to this great secrecy of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, so they don't know it until it's printed in the paper that the Federal Reserve is buying bonds. Now, they do the opposite to depress the market. The Open Market Committee will sell the government bonds, and so that extinguishes the debt, and that reduces the amount of money in the system, and it's like turning off the spigots. No more water coming out. So then the stock market drops precipitously. Here again, it's quite advantageous to know the day before that this is going to happen. And of course, the general public never knows. But there are people who do know. And when you have somebody like Greenspan, chairman of the board, from J.P. Morgan and Company, now he doesn't call up J.P. Morgan and tell them they're going to do this. J.P. Morgan calls him up and tells him to do this. So it's not that he's given them any advance information. He's just doing what he's told to do.
That's why it's very important to listen. If you notice, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, whenever he says, oh yeah, I think rates are going to go to 5%, listen to him, because rates are going to go to 5% if he says rates are going to go to 5%. It's called forward guidance. They try to guide the market along with expectations so nothing's an abrupt shock.
This is the way it's been. As I say, the whole Federal Reserve System was set up for speculators, for these people to have advanced knowledge of monetary movements, how much the price of money, the interest rate, and the volume of money that's going to be available for investment. Either it's going to grow or it's going to be less, but they decide all that ahead of time, and so they make enormous fortunes. And so the other investors, they have to do what they call Fed watching. They have to watch and guess what the Federal Reserve is going to do.
Yep.
Because I say now, people have sued to have the minutes of the Federal Reserve Board meetings made public. In fact, we had a chairman of the House Banking Committee a few years ago, Henry Gonzalez from Texas. And Henry Gonzalez sued them several times to try to get these minutes and to avoid the secrecy, but he never got anywhere because you go into courts on a deal like that. And of course, the judges are Federal Reserve judges. They may not be labeled that, but they always go with the Federal Reserve. And many people have asked me why I never sued the Federal Reserve during all these years, knowing what I know about them and having it all documented in this book. Well, to launch a suit like that, you do need quite a lot of money, $500,000 or a couple of $1 million. And of course, the advantage the Federal Reserve Board has as a central bank, whatever money you can put into a lawsuit, they can print enough, 10 times that much money to fight you. Now, that's right. So if I was able to print money, I would sue the Federal Reserve tomorrow. But unfortunately, my resources are very modest. And most people who are interested in this sort of thing, they're very modest, because you do not get very wealthy people to get into this fight. Ross Perot would never put up any money for you to sue the Federal Reserve Board, because they'd wipe him out tomorrow. And Ross Perot played the political game for years before he became a presidential candidate. He was the largest single contributor to President Nixon. He gave him $300,000. He was the largest single contributor. And he didn't do that because he liked Nixon or anything else. He did that because he was maneuvering to get these enormous Social Security and other computer data contracts from the government. So he set up a company called Electronic Data Systems, EDS, which was programmed to handle these enormous paperwork things that were set up by these Social Security Administration, workman's compensation, all these things. And he had the only system which could handle it.
That's interesting.
But having the only system it didn't mean anything. It didn't mean that much, because no matter what kind of government contract you got to pay off to get it. I mean, nothing for nothing. That's the old motto of Washington. They claim that they used to have it on the wall in the House Office building over one congressman's door, nothing for nothing. So I don't know if that's true. But anyway, even Ross Perot, who had the system to handle all this, and of course these were enormous contracts, he still had to pay his way in. So he donated $300,000 to Nixon, and he got the contracts. And of course, he became a billionaire because these were very huge contracts. So Ross Perot then came out as a white knight on a charger. He was going after Congress, and he was going to bring a businessman's point of view to Washington. Well, he was a businessman. In fact, all of his business had been done with Washington.
Yeah.
But the idea that he was going to change anything was ridiculous because he was part of the system. And see, Bill Gates was the same way. Bill Gates became the wealthiest man in the world. And well, with his Microsoft Corporation, his computer operations. And but these people in Washington were getting very disgusted with Bill Gates. And he didn't know it because he didn't know what was going on. He was spending $1.5 million a year in Washington. Here he was, biggest corporation in the country, richest man. He's spending $1.5 million. Well, my gosh, even a delicatessen would spend more than that. So they were getting very angry with him, and they realized they had to send him a message. So they had the Justice Department indict him for monopoly. And he finally got the message. He's now spending about $25 million in lobbying, $25 million a year lobbying in Washington. So now he's become a member of the team, and the Microsoft thing is not going anywhere, of course. This judge ruled against him, but that was only so you could appeal. Lawyers know that they always want you to lose the first go-round because then you can appeal for years, and this brings a cash flow into the firm. And the firm, of course, is a law firm, and to have a firm, you have to have money coming in. So this thing will drag on, and they're not going to split Microsoft into two companies because they haven't the faintest idea how to do it. But the threat is there. And I will say Gates has taken it all very well. He realizes he was set up, but it was his own fault. Well, I had thought for years, why doesn't Bill Gates start spending a little money in Washington? Why doesn't he share the wealth like everybody else? But he had no idea that he's out there on the West Coast. He had no clue as to this is the way things are done. But under a totally corrupt Federal Reserve system, this is how politics work. Yeah, he got his education very quick. But so that is the way that the Federal Reserve System works. And it is total corruption from the very beginning. It began as a criminal conspiracy. Now, people used to ask me, well, what is the Federal Reserve? It's federal, which means it's government, and it has reserves, and it's a system. Well, it's not federal, and it has no reserves. It doesn't need any reserves. When you can print all the money you want, why would you need any reserves? I mean, if you need $10 billion, you go down and print it. You don't have to have any. You don't go to the bank vault and drag out $10 billion. Just print some more. So, and it's not a system at all. It's a robbery system. I call it the Federal Robbery System rather than Federal Reserve, since there are no reserves, but there's certainly plenty of robbery. So every person in this country is being robbed by these people. And when they raise the interest rate, they're robbing you. When Greenspan started raising the interest rate, it means you got to cough up another $1,500 a month on your mortgage or lose your house and go live in a trailer. So, and you haven't got any raise. I mean, you're not making $1,500 a year more, but the interest rate pushes you into that position. You got to come up with the money or lose your home. And this is what the Federal Reserve does to people. You got a note on your car, and suddenly the interest rate goes up on that. Or you borrow money for your business, and that goes up, and maybe your business is not making that much profit. You lose your business. So these are very serious and very cruel things, because when these bankers raise the interest rates, they don't worry about whether you can meet your bills or not. If you don't meet your bills, they'll foreclose on you, take your business, and you go to work for them at a much lower salary. And so that's how it's done. But it is a system of exploitation, of robbery, because when you take money from people and don't give them anything in return, that's robbery. Because under all normal commerce, if you buy something or spend money, you get a product in exchange. With the Federal Reserve, you get nothing except the debt. You get an increase in your debt, and that's it. You do not get any goods or any advantage of any kind. You got the same house you were living in, but it's costing you an extra $1,500 a month. And that's about how much Greenspan has raised the average mortgage in the country. So if you can imagine, everybody in the United States is paying an extra $1,500 a month. And they've got to raise that money by whatever means they can, sell assets, or sell the house and move to a smaller house, which many people have done.
Unbelievable.
I know my mortgage is a fixed rate. Any loans I get are a fixed rate. So when you talk about raising interest rates, they can raise my interest rate on my house. It's a fixed rate.
Well, fixed rate mortgages are not affected, but many of the mortgages are not fixed rate anymore. They put them on a sliding scale. So you must have one of the old, very desirable fixed rates.
I guess all loans I get are fixed rates. I've never been on a sliding.
Well, all of them were fixed rates for a long time, and then they were tipped off that they're going to start raising the interest rate, so they started moving them over into. I don't know exactly how they set it up, but they make variable mortgage. They move to variables. So you got the fixed rate, you're okay. They can't do anything to you.
The thing I want to do in the future is interest rates go up and it's going to cost me more because of the cost of business. But
Well,
in the future borrowings I have.
oh, definitely.
But
So,
for current things, it doesn't affect me at all.
so you're locked into the fixed rate, you're okay.
Anything I do is that way.
But if you go into another business or something, you're going to pay the higher rate.
Yeah,
So
also all the businesses now have to pay higher rates for their loans because they're going to have to raise prices.
yeah, and the business loans are where they really make their money because most businesses have to borrow money to start up or to expand and so forth. So the house mortgage is not the ideal example because people in house mortgages are on a more fixed income, but businesses are totally at risk. They've got to raise the money or they won't have a business. So it's the businesses that really get hurt by this. But you don't hear the Republican Party complaining about the interest rates and so forth because the Republican Party, being liberal Republican, are for the bankers. And they go along with the Federal Reserve on everything. And it's amazing, too, what unanimous approval there is throughout the United States for the Federal Reserve System. You'll never hear a businessman or a politician criticizing the Federal Reserve. The only criticism for Greenspan's 6 interest rate increases since the first of the year came from the Wall Street Journal, which is sort of a voice of sanity. And they had a number of articles on their editorial page in which they criticized Greenspan's action. Well, they absolutely laughed at his claims that we were under inflationary pressure. Well, there was no inflationary pressure at all. They published the actual figures, and there was no inflationary pressure. So then Greenspan, because of this attack on the Wall Street Journal, he kind of changed his tactics. He said, well, what he was attacking was the wealth factor. Well, that made it look like he was going after the rich. So everybody thinks that's okay. Go ahead and soak the rich. But it's not the rich that pay the bills. It's the middle income and poor people that pay the bills. The rich always get a special deal, special discount, or they own the bank that owns the note and they're paying themselves. But middle income and poor people don't have that advantage. So they're the ones who are the ultimate victims of all of these policies of the Federal Reserve Board, because wealthy people always benefit from these things. They have it set up so they benefit. That's why I said that the original Federal Reserve plan was conceived by very rich people who wanted to get even richer. There were no poor people at the Jekyll Island meeting. There were no middle-income people. These people were already very wealthy, and they had this personal view of themselves as pirates. They really felt like they were sailing the seas under the Jolly Roger. And in fact, if you look at the names of their yachts, they all had yachts. So George Baker's yacht was called the Viking, and J.P. Morgan's yacht was called the Corsair, which is Corsair is a raider. So they really believed in themselves as pirates. I mean, these were not people who were out to do good in the world or to help anybody. They were out to rob and pillage because that's where the real money comes in. I mean, you can work all your life at a modest salary, or you can go out and rob people and make a lot of money very quickly. Well, these people deliberately chose the path of robbery, and it's the only path that they have. And they donate large sums to churches and universities of the stolen money, of course. And but they've set that up so they get a big tax write-off. Usually it hardly costs them anything, because they learned long ago that when you're robbing people, it's better to promote an image that you do good, you know. So that's what they do. These are all great philanthropists, all these people.
Rockefeller, did he hand out the dimes?
Rockefeller handed out dimes, yeah.
To the kids, you know.
Oh, yes.
Philanthropist.
Yes, he handed out dimes. No folding money, but just dimes. In fact, he'd get the dimes by the roll, you know, and he would hand them out. But that was his great thing. Well, to give old John D. credit, his sons and grandchildren don't even give anybody dimes. They don't give them anything. You never heard of David or Nelson Rockefeller giving anybody a dime or giving them anything. So he was more generous than they were. But old John D. set up the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was so hated at that time. Now remember, this is the man who organized the Federal Reserve meeting, and his son married Nelson Aldrich's daughter. So Nelson Aldrich represented money and privilege in the U.S. of 1900. Republican majority leader. He owned banks in Rhode Island. He had stock and everything, and he lived in a huge mansion. And his daughter married John D. Rockefeller. So, in fact, that's how Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was named after the man who chaired the Federal Reserve Board meeting. So that's how involved these people were in this whole thing. And John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s sons were named the Fortunate Five, you know, Nelson and David and Lawrence. They were the Fortunate Five. They were the five wealthiest young men in the United States and the most desirable for marriages, of course. They were the best catch because they were all going to inherit the Rockefeller fortune. And the people who bought the original Federal Reserve stock in 1914 had a monopoly because they included in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that the stock could never be bought or sold on any exchange. So if you wanted to buy stock in this magical money machine which printed money, you couldn't do it because they'd set it up that it would only be available to the people who bought it initially and who, of course, would hold on to it through their families. And so then Rockefeller set up the Rockefeller Foundation and put his Federal Reserve stock in that so that it could never be touched anyway. So that's where it is today. And that is part of the capital of the Rockefeller Foundation. Well, Rockefeller was so hated that when he tried to charter his Rockefeller Foundation through Congress, he couldn't do it. So he finally chartered it through the legislature of New York, which he owned anyway. And it was never chartered as a national foundation because nobody in Washington dared, the Senate didn't dare vote for it. So he had it there for 2 years. He couldn't get it. So he went back to New York and chartered it. And the Rockefeller Foundation then financed the takeover of the medical profession through his Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. And they have given us this big drug deal that we have today with all of the pills and all of the whole complicated medical insurance and medical practice of today all came from John D. Rockefeller. Why? Was he really interested in people's health? No. He had the oil monopoly and he was looking for other things, so he went into the medical profession, took that over. I went into the banking business and took that over from the Federal Reserve System. So this was a man who was growth-minded, as they say. He just kept growing and growing, dominating more and more. And as he went into each of these fields, he took them over totally. For instance, in the medical field, he set up a system where hospitals could only be accredited by the state legislature.
Imagine that.
And so then he controlled the legislature, so he now controlled all of the hospitals. So if you wanted to set up a hospital which, say, would offer free care to a certain number of indigent people or something like that, you couldn't get the legislature wouldn't approve it. So you wouldn't be accredited. And without accreditation, it was against the law to operate. They'd come and close you down. Armed police would come and shut the place down and throw you out. So this is, they always fall upon force as a final factor, because only by force can they force people to do the things to rob them the way they do. You got to have force. There's no way you could sit down and persuade the ordinary person to give you all of his money. You have to use a gun. So that's what all of these Federal Reserve influenced legislatures, revenue agencies, everything, the force is their only solution. And the IRS particularly has a habit of demanding initially at least 5 times what they know that you owe. If they think you owe $60,000, they'll send you a notice for $300,000. Well, the average person is totally devastated by a demand for $300,000. They don't have it, they don't owe it, they never owed it. So this conditions you to start negotiating and bring down the $300,000 to a more reasonable figure. So you wind up, you may owe them $60,000, but you wind up paying $120,000 because you got to pay more in order to get a settlement. So that's how they operate. They've been doing that for many years. Well, this is fraudulent. The IRS knows when they send out the claim that it's fraudulent, and you know it's fraudulent, but you can't go to court and prove that, because any court would say, well, the IRS agents worked this up from the information they had and from their statistics, and we can't challenge that. So some people have committed suicide because of these impositions. And as I say, the income tax was set up solely to cover up the fact that the Federal Reserve bankers had gotten a license from the government to print as much money as they wanted, and there's no restraints on it whatsoever. That's why they needed the income tax in the first place, was because they had to have some system of control, and that the income tax was that system.
Wow. I've never thought of it that way before. So he's basically saying to control inflation, they need to suck up money with the IRS that was excess money that the Fed had created. That is so annoying. Oh my God. By the way, guys, hit that like button if you're enjoying this. We got 300 watching, we got 120 likes, so let's get that up.
And they've been using it ever since, and it's invalid now, and it was invalid at that time. And as Bill Benson pointed out, to get the income tax amendment through the state legislatures, in every case, they use subterfuge, and in most cases, it was never even ratified in the first place. But they went ahead and listed it as being approved. And when he started doing his research, he was amazed at going to legislature after legislature and finding out it was totally fraudulent. It had never been ratified in the first place. So nobody actually owes any income tax at all, because the amendment was passed under fraudulent circumstances. And the man who approved it as Secretary of State was Philander Knox, who was the Wall Street lawyer for J.P. Morgan and the big the bankers who wanted the income tax. They knew they had to have the income tax, that they could not work the Federal Reserve system unless they had the income tax, because that was the only means of control that they had. And the income tax then became a weapon. They used force against people. They'd go in and seize your business, seize your home. I had a friend in Washington that owed tax, or they said he owed tax. And so he came home and went to bed at night. And during the night, they came and took his car. He just had a little Volkswagen. They took his car. And to show you how blackmail and extortion is behind all of this, he went to the IRS and bought his own car back for a few cents on the dollar. And as long as the money changes hands, they're told to bring in money, and they bring in money. They're all on a quota system, and they have to bring in money or they never get promoted. So he bought his own car back for something like $200, but now he had a car again. And that's the kind of this is a so-called government. This is not a government at all. Yes.
Are we allowed to ask questions during this discussion?
Yes, I think we've reached the point now of the workshop where we're going to the question and answer. So you go ahead.
I have a question. I first understood that when they passed the Federal Reserve Act on Christmas Eve, that there were actually only 4 people in the room. Isn't that true? It wasn't they called it a quorum, but it was really 4 people in the room.
Well, they said it was a quorum, but I wasn't there, and these people lie about everything, so I don't think there probably was a quorum. Yeah. But I don't know how you'd ever prove that, you see.
I mean, he seems to know too. I mean, we know that there were 4 people in the room, and we knew what that.
Well, see, the New York Times didn't cover any of that, and of course, my source was the New York Times. But I don't doubt it that it was totally fraud. I don't see how they could ever have passed it when all these congressmen had left town. There's no way they could have had a quorum.
Well, they did the same thing with the Brady bill.
Oh, the Brady bill, yeah, exactly, sure.
Exactly the same thing.
Yeah, whatever they want, they get.
Right. They waited until everybody left to go on vacation, and that's when they did their thing in the 11th hour. Well, it was 11 o'clock at night.
11 o'clock at night, yeah, they do that. I used to live in Washington, and we would see the lights on in the Capitol building when they were doing one of these things. George Stimson, who founded the National Press Club, he and I would have dinner together sometime and walk home at night. He lived at the George Washington Inn, which was just past the congressional offices. And we passed there one night. It was a summer night, and all the lights were blazing in all the in the Capitol, and they were debating the Marshall Bill, which was one of the great Rockefeller giveaways, because all the Marshall Plan, they couldn't call it the Rockefeller Plan, which is what it was, so they put George Marshall's name on it. It became known as the Marshall Plan. But it was actually the Rockefeller Plan to keep war production going, because the Rockefeller plants, of course, the war was over, and they would have to close down. So they kept the plants in production, only now they called it aid. And so they kept sending stuff to Europe at American taxpayers' expense for Rockefeller's profit, and it was called aid. They gave them the stuff. Yes.
I would like to have. I mean, I understand up until World War II and everything that happened. I don't know if you have enough time to kind of give us an overview of what's happened since then.
Where is this all going?
Well, it's just going, it's business as usual. They're continuing the same old system. As long as they got the Federal Reserve Board in place, they can raise the interest rate, lower the interest rate, make the stock market tighten up, expand the stock market. They've got a very workable system. I don't see any changes in it unless they're forced to change. And the Congress is totally controlled. There's only one person in Congress today, Congressman Ron Paul, whom I know very well, who will criticize the Federal Reserve. He's a lone voice. Well, in Washington, when you're a lone voice, you're really alone. Everybody knows you're alone. They know that Ron Paul is standing there, that he has no supporters in either party, either house. Yeah, he's got guts, but he's willing to do that, well, because first he's a man of principle, and he has a very safe seat in Congress from Texas. And the voters in his district will continue to send him back to Washington, but he won't be able to accomplish anything. Now, there's always been one man, one congressman in Washington who would oppose the Federal Reserve. During the 1920s, it was a congressman from Pennsylvania, who was a banker himself, and who was appalled, and his name was Congressman McFadden, and I mentioned him quite a bit in my book. And he died suddenly at a banquet one night, a political banquet, and everybody assumed that he was poisoned because he was a very dangerous opponent. And when Eugene Meyer was proposed for member of the Federal Reserve Board, That's the guy that bought the Washington Post. McFadden held hearings and showed that Eugene Meyer, who was a partner of Bernard Baruch, Baruch was appointed head of the War Industries Board during World War I by Wilson after a $50,000 contribution, and which was a lot of money at that time. And his partner, Eugene Meyer, they had the Alaska Juneau Gold Mining Company in Alaska, which is, I think, a typical fake mining operation. But his partner was appointed head of the War Finance Corporation. So you had Meyer and Baruch running Washington during World War I. And so Meyer apparently was a rather creative person. And as head of the War Finance Corporation, he printed Liberty bonds, which they sold to finance the war. And it was your patriotic duty to buy Liberty bonds. And Meyer was such a patriot that he thought as long as he was printing them, he would print them in duplicate, one for himself and one to sell to the people. So as head of the War Finance, he printed all the Liberty bonds in duplicate, and the others he sold on New York through his firms up there. No one knew that they were duplicates, of course, because who's going to check the numbers of Liberty bonds? And so with that money, he bought a big chemical company after the war, and then he bought the Washington Post. So the Washington Post was printed with the money which Meyer stole as head of the War Finance Corporation. So Louis McFadden brought this out during the hearings. And then he complained that when Meyer's assistants were bringing in the books of the War Finance Corporation, this was 1931, and the war, of course, ended in 1918, that when they brought the books in, you could see that most of the pages had been altered. In other words, Meyer's accountants were sitting up all night changing the books before they brought it to McFadden. And of course, this is another criminal endeavor. But there again, McFadden was a lone wolf, and nothing was ever done about it. And Meyer was approved by the Senate as a member of the Federal Reserve Board. And that's all in my book, too. So then after McFadden died, another congressman came along from Texas, and he was from Texarkana. And now I'll have to look and remind myself his name. Yeah, Wright Patman. And I used to go to Wright Patman's office, and he had my book right on his desk. And I quoted, I cited his letter in there from Wright Patman that he had always thought very highly of my book. But even Wright Patman, as a personal friend, was afraid to have me testify at hearings on the Federal Reserve. I was never asked. Here I was, I'd written the book, I had done all the research, I was the authority on the Federal Reserve System. I was never once asked, even by Wright Patman, to testify about pending matters when they were investigating the Federal Reserve Board. Never. Oh, they've had investigations of the Federal Reserve Board off and on ever since 1925. But they never amount to anything and the press never covers them. But I found all of these books of the congressional investigations in the Library of Congress, never been read or quoted by anybody.
So what's our next step? I mean, obviously they're incredibly greedy. You know, we hear about this talk about, United Nations taxes, and I would think it would be all, the Federal Reserve and the other central banks of Europe that are going to, try to put this new scheme together. How do you see that playing out?
Well, they're always creating money. They've created the euro in Europe, which is another Federal Reserve dollar with no visible backing of any kind. I think it's in order to cover up the fact that they're creating so much money that they need to keep taxing people and convincing people that no matter what country you're a citizen of, you got to keep paying taxes to these people for all the wonderful services you get. They talk about government services, they're always bringing that up. Well, we would have to cut services. We would have to cut the schools. And they even start closing libraries, just to convince people, say, well, we can't have the libraries open at night anymore because we're so short of funds. And the national parks, they charge you to go into national parks. Here every day they're sending billions of dollars overseas to various boondoggles. And the total budget of the whole national park system is like $100 million a year. But you hear these cries of desperation. We don't have money to fix the potholes in the parks. We don't have money to keep the campgrounds going. And this is one of the main sources of recreation for the American people, are the national parks. And yet they're starving them to death because they feel like if you really want to go to a national park, why can't you pay a fee and go? That's their attitude, yes.
Of course, the national parks have all been taken over by the United Nations, and they're called biospheres. The park fees have increased dramatically.
Oh, yes.
The rivers have been taken over by the Heritage River Foundation, so the rivers aren't ours anymore. The parks aren't ours. The revenue to go into, the amount that they charge to go into any place has quadrupled, and then they tell you no more snowmobiles in the national park.
Oh, yes.
Because they don't want us running into any nest of the foreign troops that are training as we speak.
Oh, definitely.
So what a bunch of conspiracy on top of conspiracy. This is a wall that's got to come down sometime. I think more than the tragedy of the money and the way they have stolen from us is the way they have destroyed our children.
Oh, yes.
Destroyed our children in the wars, with their vaccines, with their chemtrails, everything that they have done to us to destroy our children just makes me livid.
Oh, well, Davy Kidd, I was just talking to her here. Yes, she has the tape here. She made a complete investigation of all the school shootings. She found that every child involved in those shootings was on Prozac and Ritalin and other of these mind-altering drugs. So you're right, terrible crimes are being committed against the children, and the parents, what can you do when the government poisons your child with mind-altering drugs? It's no longer your child anymore.
Well, worse than that, you walk your kid in the mall, and the next thing you know, you've got social services showing up to take your children away from you.
Oh, yes, child
you're
abuse.
Damned if you're
Oh,
good,
yes.
You're damned if you didn't.
Oh, that's right.
They have all the power.
They have power, and as I say, they use force.
Oh, yeah.
They can accuse you of child abuse, and you look out and there's a car full of sheriff's deputies and everybody else there in your car, and you wouldn't dare resist. They'd blow you away just like that. In fact, they really like resistance. They'd like for you to come out shooting so they can use their guns, And after all, it's very boring shooting at targets in the firing range of the police all the time. To get out and shoot some real people would be a great change. Oh, I think fun, and of course, maybe put a notch or two on the barrel,
What do you think is the prognosis? What is our future?
Well, the prognosis is the government's going to get worse, and I think the people are going to resist more. I think that's the prognosis. You have the internet revolution. This stuff is suddenly going all over the country instantaneously. Before, people used to print little mimeographed newsletters 50 years ago and hand them out and reach 100 or 200 people. Now it goes over the country instantaneously. And also, by seeing it so instantaneously, it has a more immediate effect. People are more enraged by it. When you get a newsletter in the mail that someone has mailed 2 weeks ago, it really doesn't excite you, but you pick something off the internet and my God, it hits you right in the head and you're ready to do something. No, I think the tide is turning against these people. They have abused us. They have abused and taken license with everything that they did, like printing the Federal Reserve money, which should never have been allowed in the first place, because the only thing they know to do with their ill-gotten gains is to attack the people, to enslave them more, hire more police and more guns.
They take all the guns away from us, and we can't protect ourselves.
Well, that's what they've been trying to do for years.
And
They just haven't had the means to do it.
I know, but that's the way Russia was, and they couldn't defend themselves, and that's what happened to them.
Oh, yeah, Russia and Germany, they took the guns. Yeah. And no, as long as we still have privately owned guns, our freedom will last that long. The day the guns are gone, we're gone.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's happening.
Oh, yes.
Well, the big thing, I work in agriculture, and the international bankers are destroying agriculture in this country. And if you're not aware of that, I've studied that very extensively.
Oh, yes.
We now import half of our food.
Sure.
And the people, if you're concerned about food safety, most of the food that comes in is not inspected, like less than 2% that comes across the borders is inspected. So be sure if you buy fruits and vegetables that you wash them well, because the rules are different. With the NAFTA, that's again, and the GATT agreements and WTO, they have just absolutely decimated the agriculture, and it's right now direct subsidies to the farmers will be 50% of this year's income.
My gosh, that's
50%. And so, guess what? Food control is population, it's people control. And
Well, it is because they would rather have your food produced in another country and imported. Not only make a lot of money hauling it here, and they also make a lot of commissions on reselling it, but the food produced in Mexico and Chile and so forth, you see, many dangerous chemicals have been banned in this country,
right.
But Monsanto and Dow can send those chemicals to any other country,
right.
And they will produce the bright green lettuce and the big, beautiful grapes, but they're loaded with those chemicals. And we have no way of knowing that. As you say, they come across, they're not inspected. There's no way that our government agencies could ever inspect foreign farms to see how much of these pesticides they're using. So it was a great boon for the chemical companies after these things were banned here and it reduced their market here. They're selling even more overseas because over there the market is unlimited. They don't have legislatures in those countries that will meet and ban dangerous substances because there the only thing is to make money and survive. And so no, we're really endangered by the foreign produce coming in this country because it's absolutely loaded with dangerous chemicals.
Along with that, the trend is that with farming going out, we'll be in a position of surrender.
Oh yes.
Because World War II, World War I, we produced our own food and quite a lot of excess. That's not really true anymore. Yes, we have an excess of a few commodities, but generally speaking, we're on a deficit here, and we're actually importing beans out of Canada now, packaging them in Twin Falls because they can buy them cheaper there because of the exchange rate.
Oh yeah, certainly.
And the same way with potatoes. And the big corporations come to the growers, potato growers in Idaho where I live, and they extort them and say, well, if you don't take less money for your contract, and they're already basically at below production costs,
oh, yeah.
Even the best growers, and they say, well, we're going to take it to Canada. Well, they're going to take it to Canada. And you talk about the Second Revolutionary War, the British have won it economically.
Oh yes. Yeah, Canada right now is, Simplot there in Idaho, the great potato man. I think they have backed him into a corner. He produces all the potatoes for McDonald's, or did. I think I read about a year ago that they were switching to to Canadian firms. I don't think he has those McDonald contracts anymore.
Well, he has some, but, they've cut way back.
Oh, yeah.
And as they're increasing in Canada, they're just cutting us out of the picture. And the only problem they have, fortunately, climate-wise, Idaho has still the ideal climate.
Oh, yes.
And some of the other areas, that does make some differences when you're growing things. But still, they'll try to get around it. And we've taken our technology, our tax money, and helped produce food all around the world.
Oh, yes.
Make it. And the overseas, you might comment about the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, another misnomer.
Oh, it certainly
I want
is.
to tell people about that.
Well, they set up a number of those companies. Nelson Rockefeller set up one in South America, and it was called the International Overseas Company, I think. But there's a number of them. But Rockefeller set up his in Colombia to invest the money that he made supplying the Nazi submarines with gasoline during World War II. And Jed Hoover found out that he was doing this, and he goes rushing to Roosevelt. He thought he finally had the Rockefellers. And he said, Mr. President, the Rockefellers are supplying the Germans with their German battleships and submarines all through South America. And so Roosevelt said, well, thank you, Edgar. I'm so glad you brought me this information. And he put it in a file, and he already knew it anyway. But then Rockefellers had all this money after World War II, and so that they invested it in these vast enterprises down there. And I think the Columbia drug trade is probably the natural outgrowth of the Rockefeller investments in Columbia. They claimed they were just growing coffee, but drugs are a lot more profitable than coffee, believe me. Yes.
Then you may want to talk about how Vietnam, the war was extended so they could continue to bring the drugs in and the cadavers.
Oh, yes.
Oh, that was another piece.
Oh, that was a tremendous thing. All the bodies of our soldiers killed in Vietnam were brought home stuffed with huge bags of drugs, you know. And then they would open it up and take the drugs out and sell them, and then go ahead and give the boys a good, decent burial. But that was just a means of transportation. These people are so cold-blooded and so ruthless that the average American cannot begin to envision what they're like. Yes?
You mentioned earlier today that how they were trying to destroy the American people and make us paupers and everything. But for some reason, the economy is still strong, and they haven't ruined it. Do you have any more information?
Oh, yes. I mentioned at that time that we simply responded by working harder and being more ingenious, developing new methods of production. So their efforts to destroy us just spurred us on to be more creative. And this prosperity is due almost entirely to the extraordinary pressures brought on by the measures, retaliatory measures against the American people to tax them more, to be more repressive, to have more government regulations, and to narrow our markets. And we responded by making more money than ever.
Well, you know, the other thing is, look at the contrails. They dump these millions of tons of chemicals on us every day, and we're still freaking here. We should have been dead years ago.
Oh, yeah. Well, we take all these wonderful medications from Rockefeller's drug companies, and that's what's keeping us going. No, when they dump the contrails, we have to rush out and buy millions of dollars worth of medicines just to survive. So they win both ways.
But they will ruin us through agriculture.
Agriculture is the way they ruin us, because unless you live off of your land, no country can survive without living off their own land. Now, Japan, of course, they don't have any room to grow food in Japan. I have been there many times. Every inch of the land is taken up by homes and factories. So you don't have any fields of grain and all that sort of stuff. They have to import it all. But so the Japanese have to work twice as hard to produce enough money to buy their own food. And
so this video is going a little bit off the Federal Reserve. I haven't watched this one yet, but I want to show you guys what he says about the ownership structure of it. So I have another one here where I know he does hit that part. And if we can't track that down, I will give you the answer to it.
Hinder a society, the increase of, and were these depressions that we had in this country, were they planned depressions?
Every depression was artificially engineered by purely mechanical means, by suddenly decreasing the money supply, by telling the banks to foreclose all their loans. And in other words, you bankrupt everybody one fell swoop. Well, why do they want to bankrupt everybody? So they can take over their property at 1 cent on the dollar.
These gigantic foreclosures, I mean, we're talking about virtually tens of thousands of homes today in 1993 that are being foreclosed against. Is that part of this conspiracy against middle America by the international banking system or the Federal Reserve System?
That's absolutely correct. You see, the great enemy of the bankers and their conspiracy is an educated, well-informed middle class. They don't worry about the poor people because the poor people do not have enough capital or independence to ever mount any resistance, but the middle class can, because the middle class wants to defend its private homes, its little car sitting in the driveway, downsized, of course, the downsized home, the downsized car. These are all products of the bankers' conspiracy. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't drive a car as long as this room, except the bankers want you to have a little car to keep you in your place. That's the whole idea.
You know, Eustace, one of the things I can recall 20 years ago or so, that gas used to be 25 or 35 cents a gallon, somewhere in there, whether it's premium or if you had...
Chosen out of nowhere to be president of the United States, member of the Trilateral Commission, coming out of a backward state like Arkansas, one of the poorest states in the United States, because the Rockefellers went in there and bought it in 1946. Winthrop Rockefeller III owns Arkansas, and he owns Bill Clinton. The Rockefellers own him lock, stock, and barrel.
Okay, now we found out, Eustace, so far that the Federal Reserve itself is not a government agency. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Not a government agency. But yet they say that the President of the United States appoints certain people to the Federal Reserve. If he can appoint people to the Federal Reserve, don't we, you and I, as tax-paying citizens, have some control over the Federal Reserve?
Well, have you ever suggested a candidate for the Federal Reserve Board to your congressman?
No, I haven't.
And if you did, how much attention would he pay to you? I mean, suppose you said, look, I'd like to see Eustace Mullins on the Federal Reserve Board. So you write your congressman, here's a man who spent 50 years studying the Federal Reserve System. Why don't you put him on there and let him work with these people? I can tell you what, your letter would go right in the trash, because these people are chosen out of New York and London and Paris. And their background has to be that they're part of the system, or they wouldn't even be considered.
Okay, we have a system. We have a system that works against the middle class.
Right.
And that system, how does it get its money? Where does it make its money from? Does it print money?
They have what they call the magical money machine, where you put in a blank piece of paper and crank out a $100 bill. And of course, con artists used to sell machines like that at county fairs to the suckers. So now, these bankers got together and sold that machine to the people of the United States.
And we're all the suckers for it, I guess, huh?
Well, they put in the blank pieces of paper and they hand out $100, but they don't give you the $100. You have to give them $100 worth of labor or real estate for it. In other words, nothing is free. And in order to perpetuate their ownership of the magical money machine, the Federal Reserve System, they entered into the bill in 1913 when it went through Congress that you and I could never buy a share of stock in the magical money machine.
Here we
in other
go.
words, the people who...
Here we go. This is the big climax.
Bought the original stock in 1914. They own it all today. It cannot be bought or sold on any stock exchange, because if you own a magical money machine, why would you let the suckers buy it from you? You sell them the paper. You don't sell them the machine itself.
Well, how did they purchase this magical money machine? I mean, did they pay somebody off, or was it, I mean, you mentioned before Jekyll Island, and I heard that there was a no-name club at Jekyll Island. Would you tell us a little bit about that, Eustace Mullins?
Well, these are very important bankers who met there secretly in November of 1910. They left Hoboken on a sealed train, and the reporters were there, because these were very important people, and the reporters said, "Where are you going?" And they were all shouting and trying to get into the train to ask them questions. The train pulled out. They wouldn't say where they were going. They went to Brunswick, Georgia, which was the stopping place for Jekyll Island, which is just across the inlet there. And they went over to their private club, and they wrote the act in secrecy, and they stipulated it would be called a Federal Reserve System to delude the public. They stipulated that they would own the stock forever. You and I would never be allowed access to this stock. And they set up a money monopoly in violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which provided the Founding Fathers made sure to guarantee the people of the United States they would have their own money. Congress would have control over the money. So then, after they wrote this secret plan, they had to take it before Congress and persuade Congress to turn over this money power to the private bankers. They did it through bribery, through intimidation, and they got it through just before, they actually put it through after the Christmas vacation started, when some of the opponents left. Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the father of the aviator, had fought this bill through Congress. He said it establishes a perpetual money trust, and our children will be enslaved by this money trust. He said it all in 1913, and it all has come true. So They got the bill through on December the 23rd, 1913, after the opponents had left, and they immediately rushed it through. No other bill has ever been passed by Congress under the strange circumstances that the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And even the New York Times pointed out, they said, never has legislation of such major importance been passed in such circumstances.
What about the IRS? Did that come in near that same time?
Same year, 1913. The Income Tax Amendment was passed in 1913. The Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913 so that we could have a world war a few months later in 1914. All of this, you see, 1913 is a symbolic year because we're dealing with people who have a deep root in the occult and in satanic work. So for them, 1913 was the year that they wanted to force everything over on the American people, and they did.
Now, the IRS, if you have the Internal Revenue Service, which is a collection agency for the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve, because those are 2 points, those are 2 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Would you say that as of 1913, from a legal standpoint for this country, that we were 20% communist at that time?
Oh, very much so. This is a communist system. In fact, the Federal Reserve bankers originated communism. That's not generally known. But, and you had the spectacle after the Bolshevik Revolution was perpetrated on the Russian people, and they murdered the Tsar and his family. They murdered the Tsar out of hatred, greed, and envy, which is the basis of all communism, hatred, greed, and envy. This hatred, greed, and envy is the basis of every government act passed by Congress in the United States, because they hate the middle class, their greed makes them want to seize the assets of the middle class, and they have such envy that they cannot stand for anyone else to be well-dressed, well-educated, or have a nice home. They want to reduce us all to the status of Chinese coolies or serfs in old Russia.
What do we do? I mean, there must have been some people at that particular time that saw through this con game. What happened to them? People like, say, Bronson La Follette from Wisconsin and Charles Lindbergh that you mentioned. What happened to those people? Because they did stand up, some of them, didn't they, Eustace?
They did, and after Lindbergh opposed them, they financed mobs to chase him through the streets of Minnesota towns where he was a congressman and to threaten to tar and feather him. He was lucky to escape with his life. They took his books and threw them out in the piles in the street and burned them. He wrote books exposing the situation. You can hardly find those books today. They were burned.
Now, you mean to tell me that also, is that how they've been doing it? They've been buying people off ever since 1913 to keep their game. And I know in the government today there's a request by many congressmen to have an audit of the Federal Reserve. Could that do any harm?
Actually, an audit of the Federal Reserve would simply substantiate their legitimacy. I mean, you don't want to audit the mafia. Why would you audit the Federal Reserve? It's an illegal organization to start with. You don't audit a criminal syndicate. You put it out of business, and you lock up the people who perpetrated this on the American people.
Let's go back to Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson threw the bankers out one time, didn't he?
He did indeed.
And the country prospered.
Oh, tremendous prosperity. Andrew Jackson, as President of the United States, said to the bankers, "Ye are a nest of vipers, and by God, I will root you out." And so he immediately took all government funds out of the second bank of the United States, which was a central bank. And of course, they went bankrupt because they needed that money for their operating capital. And in fact, today, every bank and every business in the United States is operating on the Social Security taxes that they collect from their workers by extortion, because without that capital, they couldn't exist.
Now, what about the Rockefellers and the Kuhn-Loebs and some of the Lazarus brothers? Who actually owns the stock? What are some of the names of the people that own the stock in this Federal Reserve system?
Here we go.
Well, you know, I was the first person to ever publish those names. In fact, Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of the Banking Committee of the House back in the 1950s, and I used to visit him in his office. He was a great admirer of my book, and I have his letter reproduced in the book. And He said, you know, Eustace, I'm sitting in his office, and he said, there are two things I need. He was getting old. He said, there are two things I want to do before I die. I want to find out who owns the stock of the Federal Reserve banks, and I want to audit them. Well, he died without achieving either objective. And at that time, I myself had not completed my research to find out who the owners were. And I finally found out about 10 years after Wright-Patman died, and that information is in there. And, of course, no surprise that the owners of the stock since 1914 are the big rich, the elitists, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Warburgs, the Schiffs. And, in fact, Governor Clinton, the representative of the little man, is now going to send Pamela Harriman to Europe as an ambassador.
Tell us about, how do the Harrimans, and tell us about Prescott Bush and George Bush. I mean, if this is going to be a conspiracy, it has to kind of go up the ladder, doesn't it? I mean, are these families that kind of work themselves in and then just stay there forever?
Well, that's absolutely true, because in order to have reliable people, you have to have families which continue generation after generation. I call them the dynastic families of the world order, because these are true dynasties. You know, the old monarchical dynasties of Europe are pretty well gone, except for the British royal family. And the reason that they are still in power is they represent the old Canaanites, which go back 5,000 years, the black nobility. And in fact, most of the wealthy families of the world today are, well, I'd say all of them are in the black nobility. They're all interrelated. They have arranged marriages to protect the money, you see. And they have common goals. They have a common program. So no one is going to get in there and upset the apple cart. Now, sometimes they marry outside of their family patterns, but the people they marry are playboys. In other words, they could go to the Riviera, they can have their yachts, but they never interfere with the program of the world order.
So we're talking about the power of money, I guess, huh?
Well, it's the power of power, because money is power. You cannot issue money unless you have power. I mean, I cannot hand you a piece of blank paper and say, listen, this is a $100 bill, now give me $100 for it. In order for you to do that, I have to have power over you. So the power comes first, and the money is simply a medium of exchange, a medium of control. And in fact, the money that we have today is an obligation. It's a promissory note, promise to pay. In other words, the government has no money. You and I have no money unless we have gold and silver. What we have are promissory notes, which, by the way, Paul Warburg was so brilliant that in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, he stipulated, and it's right in the Act, you could read it, that these printed pieces of paper, which the private bankers are printing for their own profit, are then to become full obligations of the government of the United States. In other words, of the taxpayer. They can print all the billions of dollars they want, and as soon as they print that money, you and I owe that money. Not only do we owe it, but we've got to start paying interest on it immediately.
In other words, they can take a thin piece of paper, write a $1,000 bill, print that $1,000 bill, and they have created this money out of nothing. Are you telling me that?
They have testified before Congress that they create the money out of nothing. Because they had to testify that, because where else would it come from? It comes out of nothing. It's bookkeeping ledger entries. In other words, the Federal Reserve stockholders, these wealthy families, will enter into a ledger, $1 billion. And they say, now, government of the United States, American people, you owe us $1 billion. And if you don't start paying interest immediately, we'll foreclose on you.
That's the way to do it, huh?
That's the way.
How come you and I couldn't have thought of that game?
Well, we should have thought of it first. Now we're out of the picture, see?
But it's my understanding in the Bible there were two things that Jesus said was an abomination. And the second thing was usury.
That's right, usury.
And is that the reason that our country is so indebted today, because of this usury system by a group of people that print money for nothing and we pay in bondage to keep the system going?
Well, that's exactly correct. And my mentor, Ezra Pound, who started me on a campaign to study the Federal Reserve System in 1948 and commissioned me to go to the Library of Congress. He said, see what you can find out about the Federal Reserve System. Well, I didn't give a hoot about the Federal Reserve System. I was going to write the great American novel, and I had no interest. I didn't even have a bank account.
You have
at that
right
time.
here.
Well, I guess it is. It's more interesting than a novel. And so I went down there and I found out it was a criminal conspiracy, and I came back. See, Ezra was a political prisoner, held in an insane asylum for 13 and a half years without trial. I finally got a congressman interested in his plight, and that opened the door. He walked out a free man, just like that. You have to have someone to intercede for you because you're dealing with a diabolical government which responds only to force or the threat of exposure. And that's what Congressman Usher Burdick did. He went on the floor of Congress. He said, "Why is the government holding this man?" Well, they had no answer, so they released him.
So you knew a poet by the name of Ezra Pound. He commissioned you to write the first book on the Federal Reserve. He was incarcerated at that time in the United States Penal Institution or whatever, but the point is then Mr. Burdick, congressman from North Dakota, he was the one who was able to have Ezra Pound released. Is that correct?
He was indeed, and that's why you always need someone who can intercede for you, because you're dealing with a diabolical government. If you don't have some way of having someone intercede with you, you're helpless.
Now, Eustace, we have the Federal Reserve System. Does the Federal Reserve System itself, I happen to think that I've been patriotic most of my life, but the more that I see about this government, I'm not talking about the country because I love my country, but the government to me seems more and more diabolical, and I've seen my friends in business, good quality, hard-working, middle businessmen that are not in business anymore, and something has to be, I mean, there was some reason that they're not in business. It seems to me the giant corporations now own the majority of the wealth of the country. Am I imagining things, or is the small businessman, small farmer, small select individual, are they being financially wiped out?
Well, they're being wiped out by the Federal Reserve System through the Internal Revenue Service. Now, I have a friend named Paul Desfossis. He and I travel around the country lecturing together. He was an IRS agent for 20 years. And the program, he told me, the program of the IRS for the past 10 years has been to close down every small business, every independent, privately owned farm in the United States, because it's easier to control people who have no assets, who have to work for a salary for somebody. And they intend
Well, why would the government do that, Eustace?
For control. They want the Fortune 500 to own everything in the United States, to control all business, so that they don't have to deal with individuals. You see, the federal government has no power over an individual. People don't realize that. You don't even have to talk to an Internal Revenue agent, because Article 1, Section 8 of the Congress says, Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense, that is, raise armies, and for the common welfare of the United States. Well, the United States means the federal entity. So Congress, no federal entity, has any power over the individual citizen. Only the states can deal with its citizen.
You know, looking back, Eustace, in my childhood, and I'd come home and you'd see in most homes or cities in whether it was in Wisconsin or Georgia or California or New York or wherever, you see nice homes with a picket fence around. You'd see a man coming home after work with a lunch bucket, and he was raising 3 or 4 or 5 children. Normally his wife didn't work. He had probably one car in the garage. He had a nice bus system where he could go to and from work. He had a nice paycheck, and he could actually support his family. One person could support the whole family. And there was silver, that was one of the commodities of the exchange, and you had gold, and I guess even partially at that time, but the value of the money seemed to be so strong in comparison to what we have. Now, we've gone from this situation, Eustace, where a man could stand up and feed his family and be proud, to today we have sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 people working in a family just to support the same lifestyle that my father produced for our family 40 years ago. Now, has the Federal Reserve, does it have anything to do with this change in lifestyle or the way we have to work so hard just to make ends meet today?
Oh, this has been a deliberately engineered program whereby the wife has to go out and earn a living. She cannot stay home and raise the children. They want the state to control the children. In fact, Hillary Clinton is in the White House today to absolutely ensure that the parents will no longer have any say-so on the life of an American child. They are to become wards of the state. They're to be totally controlled by the state. In other words, after a man and a wife has a child, they no longer will.
All right, so I just did something cool. So I just took the information from the book of the biggest shareholders of the Federal Reserve, according to Eustace Mullins, and I ran it through Grok because it's a consortium of banks that you probably don't know the name of today because they're older banks that went through mergers and all that XYZ. But we have the answer on who the top shareholders are in the Federal Reserve today. It's going to create some new questions, but we are closer to the answer than before. So this is freaky. So check this out. So this is from the book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, according to Eustace Mullins. The top shareholder was National City Bank, which was controlled by Rockefeller and Kuhn Loeb, which is the Rothschild Bank, 30,000 shares. First National Bank, which is JP Morgan's bank, held 15,000 shares post-merger with National City Bank. In 1955, controlled nearly 1/4 of the shares. Then Chase National Bank, 6,000 shares, and Marine National Bank of Buffalo, 6,000 shares. National Bank of Commerce, New York City, 21,000 shares. So apply that to today, which is what I asked it to do. National City Bank, which is now Citigroup, owned by obviously Vanguard BlackRock, with the same amount of, with the largest shareholders in the company. First National Bank, also Citigroup. Chase National Bank, now JP Morgan and Chase. Marine National Bank of Buffalo, now part of HSBC Bank of USA, owned by HSBC Holdings. National Bank of Commerce, New York City, now JP Morgan and Chase. So it does not take much thought to see, oh, wow, it looks like Citibank and JP Morgan and Chase are the largest shareholders of Federal Reserve shares by a lot. And we know the origins of those banks and where those roots go to, as JP Morgan being a front person for the Rothschilds, dying without a lot of money, and Citibank having its origins tied to Kuhn and Loeb. So I asked to make a pie chart. It did not do that. But the way that this all pans out is that Citibank controls about 43% of the shares of the Federal Reserve, JP Morgan Chase, 30% of the shares of the Federal Reserve, and other member banks, 27% combined, including Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and a bunch of smaller banks. So when you want to know who controls the Federal Reserve and tells them what to do, it is Citibank and JP Morgan largely, with a touch of Goldman Sachs and a touch of Morgan Stanley. So now the real question is, biggest shareholders in Citibank, biggest shareholders in JP Morgan. We know it's going to be those big three names, but then that's why I was asking the question in the chat. There's got to be a connection between BlackRock, Vanguard, and Rothschild, especially with the mystery around Vanguard's ownership. Nobody knows who owns Vanguard. And Vanguard's the biggest shareholder in BlackRock. Now, with the origin of these banks, I think there's an interesting story to be told there. Now, I haven't quite gone down that rabbit hole, but I'm very interested in the ownership structure of these banks, especially with the way that the mergers happen. So let's see, largest shareholders of Citigroup. Yep, there we go. Yep. 8% Vanguard, 8% BlackRock, 4% State Street. Shocker. JP Morgan Chase. Yep. 9% Vanguard, 7% BlackRock, 5% State Street, a little Morgan Stanley. So it's just this thing where everybody owns themselves. But who is making the decision on things like interest rates and quantitative easing? And like who owns the debt that the Federal Reserve owns on behalf of the United States? You know what I mean? Still money earned, but it was possible. Sorry, back then. Are you guys following along with this, or is it too weird? Yeah, so that's the next thing I want to kind of discover is what that whole background looks like with like Citigroup merging with the National City Bank. And I know Chase Bank was originally a Rockefeller Bank, and obviously JP Morgan, that bank was owned by JP Morgan, but then JP Morgan was just a frontman for the Rothschilds. So it's entirely possible that a lot of these shares that like on paper says it's held by these banks, like the shares of these banks could be held by these families. And I have a suspicion that things like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street are a cover for like the big money families. That is my suspicion. But with that said, maybe we do a few questions and then we call the night because it's 1:30. So any questions before we get out of here? We're at 2:07 right now. We'll go to 2:10 unless there's some banger questions. I dig it. Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Don't know what that is. So many Vanguard statements, meaning like opinions about Vanguard or statements from Vanguard, like financial statements. What are you talking about? Start digging, but where to begin? I have a suspicion, Landon. Don't worry. He said a fascination with the occult. Yep. So you have a school payment that is placed in your home collateral. Bit can now go out and get new bonds and loans. Thank you, Sadie. I'm glad you found us. So we need to find the family trees of these entities. They are definitely 100% covered within deeper over. Yep, and that's what I'm saying. I'm going to try to make some kind of crazy scatter plot chart or something with all the connections because like I see it in my head, but we need to get it down on paper or a graph. Who was the man in the interview being interviewed? Eustace Mullins, historic legendary researcher on the Federal Reserve. Trying to decide which book to launch the book club with next week when the Minect Circles gets going. It's either going to be Creature from Jekyll Island or The Secret to the Federal Reserve. I think The Creature from Jekyll Island might be better because it's more all-encompassing. It's not like entirely focused on who owns the Fed because we kind of got to the bottom of that, but they're both insane books, so you can't really go wrong. Maybe we shall put it to a vote. Will tonight's live be available for us to go back and rewatch? Of course, Christine. I'm a man of the people, and I want everybody to have access to this. So, yes, it'll be live. It'll be available to rewatch once I close it out, it'll be on YouTube and there for anybody who wishes to watch it. Thanks for sharing an update. Thank you guys for watching. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. I know, Crystal, it is wild. It is so wild. And, you see people out there protesting about Doge auditing the Treasury. Like, this is the stuff they should be out there protesting. Like, how could you not be enraged by, like, these people cram this thing through Congress, like, the day before Christmas when nobody's there, totally illegitimately. Then they create the Fed, they create the IRS, and we're just basically debt slaves ever since then. Like, there's a reason that Trump keeps saying that the most prosperous time was between 1870 and 1913, because that was the time that we didn't have a Fed, that we didn't have a central bank, and that we didn't have a war going on, right? Really, that was the only time. Yeah, that was the only time in American history, I think, that we did not have a central bank and that we did not have a war going on, 1870 through 1913. So let's give that a try again and see how it works out. Oh, God. That's a whole another conversation. I think a lot of it might have to do with the Schofield Bible being written by the Oxford Publishing House that might or might not have been owned by the Rothschilds, and them adding a few select paragraphs in there that tell them to feel a certain way. That is what I've heard. I have not confirmed it yet, but there's some weird stuff with that needs to be looked into. Me and my buddy Connor from Value Team that you guys have seen on Unusual Suspects, we're digging into that a bit. Thank you for being here, Leroy. Yeah, we have a really good crew here. We're growing. We have a lot of cool people, and I'm very happy about that. So what is your options for holding investments if you didn't want to be doing business with these banks? Well, you kind of have to do business with them right now, unfortunately, because like the way that the system's set up. But I don't know. I can't give financial advice, but I think just to be like as diversified as possible in terms of like investments and ways that you hold and store money is the most durable way to operate. I like don't go all in on one thing. Like, believe me, when I first read The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is like almost like 7 years ago at this point, like I rushed to the bank and like started trying to withdraw all my money and go buy gold and like freaking store it in a safe, which that was an overreaction. I think just like diversify as much as possible with investments and with methods of storing money, like, some in your bank, some in your crypto wallet, some in a safe, some like in retirement accounts and whatnot. Get creative. Like, don't be all in on anything is my opinion, and not financial advice, because I have to say that. Talk about how BlackRock controls companies through investments. Yeah, of course. I mean, they admitted it. They bragged about it. They control the flow of like your retirement account money, and they get to decide which companies they invested in. So yeah, it's a massive amount of control. And another really cool perk that they got is they were the special contractors, I guess, like the experts that the Federal Reserve calls when there's a financial crisis. They call BlackRock and they ask BlackRock what to do with the printed money once it's printed. And that's an overly simplified way of saying it, because the term money printing is like a term for the layman to just help people understand what's happening. But what's really happening is that the U.S. Treasury is issuing new bonds, which are being bought by the Fed through commercial banks, because it's illegal for the Fed to buy bonds directly from the Treasury. So they have to, commercial banks have to buy bonds from the government, and then the Fed buys the bonds from the commercial banks. But yeah, so BlackRock gets to decide how the new money is spent when they're in crisis mode, trying to repair the economy mode. So they get a lot of perks with that. When I say hot profiles jumping out of tall buildings, then you know Trump's doing something. Thank you, Sadie. Have you heard the idea that the origins of money was always for the enslavement of nations? No, not necessarily. You might have to expand on that. Have you seen 38 states have laws that ban government contractors to boycott Israel? Wow, no, I have not seen that. Let me take a screenshot of this text so I can look into that after, because that is not good if that's the case. Not good. CC Google. Oh, Jim. Jim. I know. It's bad. It's bad. Like, you just got to remember, like stay centered. All right. Like, don't let it pull you in. It's a vortex, but like stay centered, you know, like don't let yourself go all the way there. Like fight it, resist it. Cause even if, let's hypothetically say that it's all true, like you can't live in that reality where you think it's all true, because you're gonna get yourself in trouble. Right. Like, if you know what I mean. If anybody watches the video that Jim is talking about there, you'll see what we mean. So it's just like an interesting alternate perspective. I don't know if it's true. Like, I tell everybody, check it out, fact check it all the way through. I don't know, but it's definitely something that you can't go just talking about at like parties and on camera and stuff like that. It's a very sensitive theory, and yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, don't let it consume you. Watch it in a healthy way. Take it with a grain of salt. All right, like, it was even banned on X, so that's a sensitive topic right there. So be careful, Jim. But I'm glad you're watching. Hate this new phone. All right, post. What are we doing? Vanguard doesn't hold Bitcoin like BlackRock, although they own Bitcoin through shares of BlackRock and Michael Saylor's company. Yeah, Vanguard's creepy. So Vanguard is the biggest shareholder of BlackRock, but Vanguard is a private company, so we have no earthly idea who owns Vanguard. So that is one of the great mysteries of life, is who really owns Vanguard, because we have no freaking idea. Who owns Vanguard might be the people who run the world. Because I think Vanguard intentionally stays a little bit smaller than BlackRock, so they're like out of the, I don't know, like they're not like front and center. But I think Vanguard's a little bit more scary than BlackRock. Seeing visual here, I have time to deep dive. Sweet, yeah. The more of us who are deep diving, the better, and then we could, combine our information to making the best outcome possible. And that's a big thing that I want to do with this book club that I have launching next week when this feature on my next gets launched. I want it to be like a sort of research hub of great minds. Like the thing's really cool the way it's set up, and it'll allow for a lot of collaboration. So I'm excited about that. Yes, great book, Alan. One of the best. UK, England, first time watching good stuff. Future looks dark. Vanguard didn't do anything but. Come on, the future doesn't look dark. We're like, compared to 6 months ago, the future looks insanely bright. All right. 101 hat, by the way. Gold edition. You're helping me piece together my family centuries old family legacy. What does that mean? New episode of Shangri-La and Solo leveling is out. I don't know what that is. Always thought Rockefeller owned the Treasury. So I the way that I perceive things from that I've found is I think Rothschild's bigger than Rockefeller. I think Rockefeller was scared of Rothschild. I think that Rothschild enabled Rockefeller to do what they did because they were willing to play ball with them. That's what I've gathered. And by the way, whoever owns the most U.S. debt owns the Treasury, which is why here, you know what? This is the perfect time to show this. Largest U.S. debt holders. So this is creepy. Watch this. If I could find this thing quickly. Yep. Here we go, I think. Is this the right one? Yes, this is the right one. Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. This is creepy. Very creepy. Very, very creepy. Check this out. This is the largest debt holders. All right, so which is the right one? All right, so everybody thinks that the international debt holders, oh, wow, China owns so much debt, Japan owns so much debt. Nope. Actually, 79% of the U.S. debt is held by the domestic public, not international government debt. So debt out of the debt held by the public, what is the biggest number on here? So it's not the Fed. The Fed's the second biggest number. Other is the biggest number. So I don't know about you, but when I see the word other as the biggest debt holders, that makes me think of big, scary, anonymous trillionaires that we don't even know about. And whoever this is, that's who owns the Treasury. That's who owns the United States to a degree. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, same thing. 29%. And then, so look, I mean, so you got big, scary people, other, the Federal Reserve, like also largely owned by those big, scary people. Mutual funds, that's BlackRock, which also has a lot to do with that and probably has a lot to do with that. And depository institutions and the state and local governments, it's like CalPERS and pension funds, like as massive as they are, it's all the way down there. Insurance companies, as massive as they are, it's all the way down there. So we got some creepy stuff there. But I hope that answers your question, Sadie. Thanks, Kevin. You're the best. Let's make it happen, Alan. Let's make it happen. Unless it's Vance. I'll let Vance go first if he wants. Yeah, the weird thing about Bitcoin is that it got launched 1 month after the financial crisis of 2008/TARP program. That's when the white paper got released, and it gets launched in January of 2009. So a little weird. Oh, yes. We're just getting started here, Sadie. You the man, Alan. Yeah, it'll go up as long as the M2 money supply is going up also. Good question, LMG. How do you feel about investing in markets, et cetera, knowing what you learned from tonight? So there was a period of time where I was just like of the mindset of like there's no way this thing can keep going up. Like I'm going to try to short the market. I'm going to try to buy puts and whatnot. And yeah, it didn't work out so well. And but the good thing about it was that the money I lost trying to short the market, like every time I would try to short something, I was blown away that it didn't go down because like I had the case in my head from a fundamental standpoint of like, oh yeah, like this thing is going to go down because XYZ. Like, it's very logical. But each time I got kind of blown out with that, I'd be like, okay, like, where did I go wrong with this? Like, why is this going up? What was I missing? And I like learned in great detail exactly why things go up and why things go down, what kind of factors you could miss that'll make them go up. So, I mean, keep in mind, like, the system's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's overextended. Like, yeah, we're probably due for like a serious pullback, but at the same time, the rate at which the dollar is getting devalued, like, that's a big part of why the market goes up too. Because I mean, currency devaluation is like very good for the stock market, good for asset prices. I mean, that's why if you owned a house or owned shares of the S&P 500 in 1971, you're doing pretty good because you're able to at least keep up with inflation. Like, that's why houses cost like what, $20,000-$30,000 to buy in the early 70s, and today they're like 500,000. That's inflation. That's why the S&P 500 cost like, I think it was like $300 a share in 1970. It might have been less than that, and now it's like 6,000 a share. So I definitely wouldn't like I would definitely feel very uncomfortable being all in on the market. Like, if my entire, say, retirement account was like in the market, wouldn't feel great about that. But at the same time, like, they set those things up in a way where if you were to withdraw, you got to pay taxes on it, which is like 30%. So, I mean, like, like, if you were to withdraw that, you're basically saying that like you think the market's going to go down more than 30%. And, like, at that point, it's like you might as well just keep it in there. But yeah, I like to be more of an active trader. I like to kind of ride the waves and then jump out and then maybe short it, ride the wave down. So I've never been a big like, except for certain things like companies that I strongly believe in, or like cryptos I strongly believe in, like XRP I own a good amount of, and like that's just more of a buy and hold thing for me because I, one, don't really have a lot of time to swing trade these days, and two, I just strongly believe in it as a technology, as a product. I think it is the best suited to serve a role that the financial system dearly needs, which is just fast, cheap, easy payments that can go cross borders, cross countries. Not financial advice, just my opinion on XRP. And yeah, so I think that you got to like kind of argue with yourself, like, as much as like we think it's a disaster of a system, we think it's like going to fall apart at any time. Like, it could also be the opposite. It could also be like the largest period of economic growth we've ever seen because of some of the like right policies happen. But that's why I say like, just be diversified. That's the safest bet. Have some gold, have some crypto, have some real estate, have some S&P, have some maybe like volatility hedges where you could talk to people that are better suited than me to cover yourself with like in the case of the market going down. But there's a way to set it up where you could basically kind of balance out your portfolio for if like the things are supposed to go up, go down a certain amount, you have a portion of it allocated to like VIX options where that'll go up enough to offset the losses for the things that are supposed to go up. So, I mean, that's something you could connect me for if you want to have a deeper conversation about that. I usually put the next thing in my link or description, but yeah, if you want to have a deeper conversation about that, Brandon Aceto, I'm next. But hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, awesome having you here, Darby. Wonder what 1913 means to the occultist. It means the freaking gold rush began. That's what it means for one thing. Wow. Very interesting. So many documents. So my document I just uncovered from parents' taxes from back in 1980s, both financials for Vanguard. There is trusts. Yep, it runs deep. It runs deep. Vanguard runs deep. Next live, it should be tomorrow night. If it's not tomorrow night, it'll definitely be Monday night. But yeah, I usually aim for 8:30 every night. You know what? Tomorrow night, I might have a meeting actually. But yeah, either tomorrow night or Monday. Sorry that I get a little sporadic sometimes with the timing of these things. Things have been hectic, but I'm still trying to hit it every night. But yes, either tomorrow night in the 8 to 10 o'clock time frame or Monday night around 8 to 9 o'clock. Sorry for the lack of precision, Christine. We will get better with that. That interview, I think it was like in 2003 or something. Or no, he said Clinton was president, so it must have been right at the end of Clinton's presidency. What are you shushing me for? Good question, Darby. I don't know. I'll look into that. If you could look into that and then enlighten us in the next live stream, that'd be awesome. The more people looking stuff up, the better. Trump is onto it, but if he smashes it, he'll replace it with what? Trump power? Well, what JFK tried to do with the Fed is he tried to take the power of issuing currency away from the Fed and give it to the Treasury, because the Fed issues us debt at interest, which is fucking crazy. Like if the Treasury was issuing debt, like it wouldn't set high interest rates for itself. And I mean, that's why Lincoln created the greenbacks during the Civil War, because the central bank was trying to get the European central bankers were trying to give them loans at 19% interest. And he said, yeah, screw you. And then he created his own currency, and then they whacked him. Yeah, Trump's a beast, Sadie. He's such a beast. And I want to see Pam Bondi get her hands on those freaking Epstein files, though. I trust her for now. I know she's trying, but I want to see that stuff. And some people have to go to jail for that. It is crazy. The protesting is guided, selective outrage, and forces and mainstream media. Yep. A lot more. Oh, I'm so sorry, Crystal. That's terrible. Very sorry about that. All right, come on, Chemtrail, take it easy. I know that's there, but let's be optimistic. Shivi mobbing. Yeah, the best way to connect here, I'll put my Monect in here right now. That's the way that people usually contact me. Let me do this real quick. Putting them in the chat if anybody wants to contact me. All right, there we go. Pinning that in the chat. If you want to connect with me, hit me up on Monect. I would be happy to talk to you about anything you want to talk about. Let's see. What else we got? Yeah, Crystal, I'm extremely sorry to hear that. Very, very sorry. Yeah. Cash is king in some ways. It's not the king of preserving your wealth against inflation. It's great when you want to buy things when prices come down, but I noticed that rich people, their version of cash is short-term T-bills, like 2-month treasury bills that, like right now, for example, like a short-term treasury bill, 2-monther or 1-monther pays you like 4% interest per month. So, I mean, that's pretty sweet versus just holding cash. And they're very liquid. Read Alan's post. I haven't read Alan's posts. Did I miss something? Gather gold, stack silver, be your own boss, be your own bank. Preach. Let's see. Oh, wow. Yeah, my great-grandfather also served in the Second World War as well. Oh yeah, there's some crazy stuff with the music industry corruption. Big time slaps with that. Start your farms, grow gardens, gather gold, stack silver, BYOB, be your own bank. Alan, I always wonder what your house looks like. Like, it must be the like most intense setup with just like those like secret walls, like where you bang on the thing, like it flips around, a bunch of guns on it. You got your like own hydroponic gardens inside and whatnot, and like a force field and like a moat around the house. Yep, silver's gonna have a good day someday when the bankers stop just pounding with shorts. All right, what time is it? It's 2:06. Let's see. Wow, that's interesting, Crystal. All right, guys. This was a fun one. We're going to do a lot more of these going forward. A lot of stuff that nobody's talking about. Like, I feel like everybody's doing the whole like recap of the news each day, which I'm going to continue to do because it's a wild time in history where there's so much happening every day, and I feel like it's important to talk about in a fun, efficient way with a community of people that we like and enjoy to kind of hang out with. But definitely going to be doing a lot more of these things where I highlight and showcase and talk about things that nobody else is talking about, because it's important and we need to know where to direct our outreach towards. So with that said, thank you all for watching. It's amazing that we had a couple hundred people here watching this late at night. Honored that you guys trust me with your time and know that I'm always going to do my best to bring you information that's exciting, enlightening, and educational in a fun way. That's what we try to do. We try to leave you better than we found you, and I always strive to do that. So thank you for watching. As always, if you want to connect with me on the next and have a deeper conversation, recommend topics, do your research together, really anything, I put the link in the chat. I'll put it in the description as well. And until tomorrow, God bless. Thank you. Have a great night.
We talk about the deep state, we talk about the globalists, inflation versus deflation.
Well, I mean,
Here at Mar-a-Lago, I'm baffled that this isn't front page news.
Do you guys support a specific political party, or do you dislike both of them?
Oh, it worked like a charm on you guys.
Let's go, Brandon.